I'm Ciaran the Quarrelsome, and I'm joined by James, and
No
we're
nickname.
yeah.
I've got to get one. I've got to get a nickname.
I've adopted some silly name and I've just kept it and then got it tattooed on my chest. So I'm going to just keep using it because I'm committed now. So, what episode is this, James? 3 would it be? Is it 4?
It's funny, we haven't done many, but because we have so many conversations, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's whatever one
Comes
we
after
end
the
up
last one.
putting on the label. But so what we're going to be chatting about today is China, and specifically because James came across an awesome article on Atlantic written by General McMaster about that basically details, I suppose what you could call Chinese governmental expansionism internally and externally. So internally in terms of the way that they've it's a good summary, and it's because he's got this book coming out later this month, and it's a cool summary and overview of what's going on within China in terms of their, I suppose, totalitarian grasp on their own populace, and then what's going on internationally with their different kind of initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, etc. So I suppose I'll hand it over to James to because I really enjoyed the article, and it's almost, I suppose it's more so even an essay than an article because it's a segment from a book long. So I'll hand it over to James to let us know why he chose that one in particular, and then after that, then we'll end up jumping in somewhere talking about the Chinese Communist Party. And
as you said, it was H.R. McMaster called "How China Sees the World," posted in the Atlantic, and it is very much, as the title suggests, sort of it, because the subtitle to that is "How China Sees the World and How We Should See China," and so that's very much to say, let's actually step back from this, take more of a macroscopic view, and see what their intentions are, what their approach is to their foreign policy, and how that should dictate our approach to them. It's similar in thinking to an article I read by Andrew Sullivan. I don't know if you know Andrew Sullivan. Yeah, brilliant writer. And that was where would that have been posted? Can't remember. But Andrew Sullivan.
New Yorker, is he?
Yeah, that you're right. Yeah, it's the Intelligencer. Yeah, the New Yorker magazine, and he had a time for a conscious decoupling from China, and he very much made the argument that we were misfooted in how we've approached it thus far. And here McMaster's sort of looking at, so it's split into 3 parts, isn't it? The first one's the Forbidden City, and it's very much because he was so what was his position in Obama's cabinet? I forget what it was, but he was there with Obama in a trip to China, and as they were shown around, they were given this history of the Forbidden City, and McMaster almost stood there, and I respect the hell out of this, because this is sometimes what I like to do, is you're there, but you're there almost observing yourself from a external viewpoint, seeing yourself there and how they're trying to make you think. So rather than be completely influenced by their story, he's more going on a metacognitive level, thinking, what are they trying to make me think with this story about China? And then from there he goes into what I think is just the brilliant, I forget what he calls it, there's something triad, the 3 prongs actually, he calls it the 3 prongs. And I love this because the Belt and Road, so he splits it into 3. When I say he splits it into 3, he looks at 3 different mechanisms by which China are trying to influence, or at least how they've broken down their wider goal and in their setting of their place on the global stage. We can actually go into that later. We don't need to sort of go through them now. But I mainly pointed you to it, because I just thought, I haven't read something, because it's actually called a story in the Atlantic. It's not like the article. It's a story by H.R. McMaster, and it feels like a narrative in as much as he really takes you down this journey of, this is China, this is what their approach is, and this is how we should approach them. And that's the third part, strategic empathy, as opposed to
strategic narcissism.
Strategic narcissism. Brilliant. Which is to say, everyone wants to be like us, and they should want to be like us. It's more like actually empathizing with them and how they want to be. So that was a bit of a messier introduction than I would have liked to have given it, but yeah, that's sort of.
No, it was a good overview, man. I think I kind of, when it comes to China, I think people who aren't very familiar with the realities of Chinese politics, I think, and the society, I think those of us in the West, let's say, I think a bias that it's easy for us to have is that, if you're not familiar with it, is that because China is such a big player on the world stage, and because just made in China is this sticker that we see on stuff all the time, and because they're this player in all these different government, international institutions and such, that there's this kind of, unless someone's aware that is a totalitarian dictatorship, they might not realize the realities of what China actually is, which is an ideological dictatorship, and more so then is like a cult of personality around their leaders, and there historically always has been since 1949 anyway, when Mao took over, and where the Communist Party ended up getting in, and Mao ended up getting control after that. But I think there's a way of, and then for those who do know about Chinese politics, like he talks about it in the piece, who are familiar that it is a dictatorship, it is ideological totalitarianism, but there was this kind of assumption that, okay, when they get into the global market and then they're allowed into these international institutions like the WHO or what name escaped me, the other ones escape me now, but they're like that they're going to end up, that eventually, as the populace gets wealthier, they're going to get more independent, and eventually they're going to end up kind of democratizing and liberalizing.
Exactly.
And there was this thought that was going to be the case, whereas I think that's one thing that was, I think, neglected, was that China did a really good job of, what was not assumed was that they'd use the wealth to actually strengthen the ideological grip they have over their populace. So it was like, last year was the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square massacres. The 4th of June last year was the 30th anniversary, and the 31st anniversary is coming up soon, actually. Yeah, the 4th of June was the massacre, the 5th of June. And since then, they've just had so much more money. Like that was where they massacred thousands of, an unknown amount, but at least in the thousands, from what foreign journalists reported. And because there was 1 million students in the square at one point protesting for democracy, 1 million people, student led, and what I think, since then they've used the wealth generated by partaking in the global market structures to be able to actually develop this insane surveillance state that for someone within China who plays the game and isn't a Uyghur, isn't a Tibetan, and they're particularly if they're, let's say, if they're ethnic Han Chinese, as long as they play the game and they play along and they don't rock the boat in terms of questioning the party or being being any kind of a dissident whatsoever, then that kind of person ends up in a kind of almost a mishmash of 1984 and Brave New World, where there's this insane surveillance state with huge technology, to the point where they have this social credit system and everything that they've rolled out of late, starting with Shanghai, I think. And but then also there's a lot of wealth, and there's a huge middle class where people are able to just buy stuff and partake in insane kind of commercialism that was kind of, I suppose, what the West has been doing for ages. But the difference is that it's a lot of the companies, and then within China, all these companies are all, if businesses want to do business in China, they have to be linked with the CCP essentially. So I think there's a lack of for either I think for the, let's say, the average person in the West who doesn't know anything about Chinese politics, they're only able to interpret the world given their own lens, and when they look out at the world as someone who lives in a Western liberal democracy, and then they see all the other major players in the world, with the exception of Russia being a Western liberal democracy, that they're coming into contact with the America or US or any Western Europe and Australia anyway, or Japan, I think, and then it's kind of obvious that Saudi Arabia aren't the most pleasant, but they're not anywhere near on the world stage like China is. So I think it's almost cool to start with the third point, which is that strategic empathy, like, versus narcissism, because
sounds
then
like a natural, From what you were just saying, that sounds like the sort of the natural jumping off point is into that strategic narcissism, because that's exactly what you're talking about, is this framing of China as a country that once it gets a taste of the benefits of opening up, at least in regard to the free market side of things, once they get that, they'll see, oh, okay, well, actually, perhaps it's also worth liberalizing to some degree, allowing for more speech than we're allowing for, perhaps allowing certain websites that disagree with us to disagree with us. And that was just the assumption, was they will come along for the ride. And what China has shown us is that you can have very efficacious free markets without necessarily conferring any of the liberties that we would have otherwise as a Western nation associated with free markets. And this is allowed for by a unique trait of China, which isn't shared by another communist state like North Korea, which is this 80-20 rule of China accept a bit of imperfection. North Korea don't. North Korea don't allow for any imperfection in their government, which means that they could never go back on the agricultural disaster which led to mass famine and killed many of their own population. They could never go, that was a mistake and we're going to fix it. And so they dig themselves into holes, which means they could never be a China with this current ideology. But China have an 80-20 rule where it's like, we are 80% gods. We are 80% perfect. But 20% of the time, we could have done something a little bit better. And with that 80-20 rule, that just allows them this vice-like grip over their populace, and yet also the room to expand and experiment and try new things. And it's unique to them, because most communist states don't allow for that sort of. And the way they've managed to do it is, it's imbued a humanity into the emperor and the CCP, which is also is simultaneously false but also true. It sort of made them look more relatable, but it's also conferred a massive benefit to them, which is to say they can more manipulate. And so, to go back to the more broader point, we didn't see that they'd want to take free markets and consciously avoid liberty. But that's exactly what they wanted. They went into it when they first started introducing any sort of capitalist ideology. When they imported that, they did so with the mind towards, we will not allow this to ever drift towards freer peoples. At least not in a consequential way with regard to how we control them. So that mindset wouldn't have made sense to us. Why would you want to keep your people subdued? Like, what if we can show you the benefits of not doing so in one area, why would you still want to do so in other areas? And that didn't compute with us, and that's the strategic narcissism. That's projecting our ideology onto them, and they didn't share it at all.
I think there's 2 points. First of all, I don't know if it was a Freudian slip or if it was on purpose that you used the word emperor to describe what I think was Xi Jinping. So that's something else that's really important that not a lot of people know about China, which is that typically the way things have worked in China is that there's 3 main jobs, but they're all held by the same person. So there's the head of the Communist Party, which has no term limits. It's just the head of the Communist Party. But the head of the Communist Party is also the head of the military, which also has no term limits. But what did have term limits was the presidency. And the way it would typically work is the same person would hold all 3 of those jobs, but they'd hold it for 5 years, and then towards the end of that 5-year period, they'd elect their successor, and then their successor would be essentially kind of trained in, I suppose, for the second term of 5 years, and then the president would step down, and then the successor, has been onboarded for the second term of the previous president's presidency. So what Xi Jinping did in 2017 was he simultaneously removed the term limits on presidency under the guise that he was trying to align the president, which was the only thing that was stopping it from being a genuine, like an emperor or a king situation, you know. So he'd removed the term limits on the presidency, so that under the guise that they were just aligning the temporal restrictions with the other 2 jobs of head of the military, head of the Communist Party. But he was basically just turning it into a dictatorship, like an autocratic, like turning himself into Emperor Xi, essentially. And he did that in 2017. The second thing was that, and I was thinking about this morning. There was a great quote in the piece where McMaster wrote. He said, "The fears and ambitions are inseparable. They explain why the Chinese Communist Party is obsessed with control both internally and externally." So a number of different things came off the back of that for me, right? One was the Nuremberg trials after the World War II when the Nazis fell. That the Communist Party had been in charge for so long, and there's been so much atrocities, that even when they got into the international global markets in a big way, and they started making big money and everything, there was individuals within the party who had done very heinous stuff and who had suppressed all sorts of issues. And think about, like, let's say, for example, individuals that ordered the Tiananmen Square massacre within the Chinese Communist Party. Think about, in the mid-90s, they're still involved. In the early 2000s, they're probably still involved. There are potentially still people in the CCP today that were around then in 1989 when the massacre was ordered. Do you know what I mean? So maybe weren't leadership positions, but they've done other stuff since, like all sorts of persecution of the Buddhists. There's more than 1 million, like Amnesty. I've seen some estimates of up to 2 million, 1.5 to 2 million Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps in the Xinjiang province, as well as all sorts of other stuff of people going missing, like Dr. I. Fenn, I think, is still missing. Not the whistleblower of the coronavirus, but the whistle giver, the one that alerted the other doctors who then became whistleblowers. I think I. Fenn is still missing. And there's another fella, a businessman called Ren Ziquan. I can't pronounce his second name. I think he's still missing as well, because he called Xi Jinping a clown for his handling of he called Xi Jinping a clown on his blog, on a blog post, critiquing Xi Jinping's handling of the coronavirus outbreak. And he's still fucking missing. And there's countless. I think at one point I read about they just took the head of Interpol. Just took him. and they didn't give them back, and it's like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. International community, Interpol wanted their men back, and China just wouldn't give them back. So like, this is thinking about all the decisions on an individual basis that contributed to all these people going missing, these massacres, these concentration camps, this all sorts of suppression of political dissidents, all this stuff. If they were to democratize, there are still potentially people in decision-making positions who don't want rule of law because of the potential for something like a Nuremberg trial.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. That's the first part, is individual fears of retribution for heinous acts. The second thing is, I genuinely, because this is another thing that Stephen Kotkin has talked a lot about, who's this expert in Russia and Stalinism and the fall of the Soviet Union and just Russia in general. And he's talked about one of the most important things he's learned from studying documentation and from studying records and diaries and conversations between during Soviet Union period up to the end of it in the late 80s, early 90s, was that the key people genuinely were communists. Like, it wasn't just a power game. It wasn't just a power game. It was like they genuinely were ideologues. And I think that's the case in China as well, is that they're not just ideologues. There's not just ideologues at play that are just communist, but also in a kind of a fascist interpretation of the world, which is that there's something that makes them inherently special because they're Chinese. I'm not talking about regular Chinese people. I'm talking about the big decision makers in the Chinese government, in the Communist Party. Not only do they genuinely buy into the, what do they call it, socialism with Chinese characteristics model, but they also have this teleological view of something being special about China, and that's inherited from the historical viewpoint, like they described in the Forbidden City element of. They described one particular politician in China, McMaster did, who was talking about them. They're bragging about not needing US anymore, and that US's only job is to give us raw materials because we're just going to take over the world economy, Yeah. And that this genuinely like fascist Aryan race kind of strange religious thing where they think they're special simply because they're Chinese. So that there's some kind of guiding hand that makes them special because they're Chinese. Yeah. And there's that kind of racial superiority kind of a thing going on as well.
There's a lot of racism in China, and it's being exacerbated now because now it's being encouraged by the government itself in regards to support of conspiracy theories about the US Army having brought over the coronavirus pandemic. And prior to that, though, certain minorities were just, and everyone's a minority in China if you're not Chinese, but certain
Chinese in particular.
Yeah, certain people.
Ethnic Han. If you're not ethnic Han, you're in a totally different, totally different game in China. Then, like, even.
Yeah, you're not welcome into hotels, or it's a different ball game entirely.
China is socialist in that respect, the same way that they call themselves socialists, but they're socialists the same way that the National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiter Party, aka the Nazi Party, were socialist.
The National Socialist Party, yeah. Yeah,
that's what they were. They called it the German National Socialist Workers Party. That's what the Nazis were. But they were only social. They privatized loads of businesses. They're even better at being fascists than the Nazis were, because the Nazis even allowed more free market. The Nazis actually privatized loads of businesses that were government owned, but the Nazis actually kind of had less intervention in a load of companies than the Chinese government do now. So like I've gone down the rabbit hole of Nazi economics a bit as well last year, and what went on there. So like these are really important aspects of understanding the realities of China, is being aware that they're genuine. So I suppose these are leaders. Like, again, I have to reiterate, it's not about the people of China. It's like, because it's the people that are making decisions governmentally. is that a genuine belief and a kind of a teleological Aryan race superiority of the fact that they're Chinese, that's embedded in all sorts of narrative fallacy, historical stuff, as well as a resentment of the way that they were treated in the early 20th century and in the 19th century, especially by the likes of Japan, let's say, who did all sorts of fucked up shit to China. And then a genuine belief in this Communist Party and what it stands for as this Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics model that they're applying, plus a genuine fear at an individual level. I imagine, this is my speculating, of course, all this is speculation, but a fear at an individual level for retribution should there ever be rule of law and democracy at an individual level for stuff that went on, like is still going on now with Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps, etc. So I think they're like really key points, as well as we talked about this in, I think, potentially a previous recording, that the main thing from a political perspective that people need to realize who don't know anything about China is that if you're an average person in China, the only way you have, if you're an average person in the Western liberal democracy, you have the ability, there's something incentivizing politicians to act in your favor, and at least if you assume all politicians are unpleasant, we can get rid of them with ballot paper, and we don't need to use bullet shells. Whereas if you're in China, your only option to get rid of politicians is with bullet shells, because you don't have any. They call it a meritocracy, but it's essentially that's irrelevant. It's a dictatorship. There's only two types of governments: those that are subordinate to the people, like a democracy, of course. And then those that where the people are subordinate to the government, which is a totalitarian. And in a totalitarian situation, the only way to get rid of politicians is with violence, bloodshed. In a democracy, we at least have the ability, if you assume all politicians in every type of government are all unpleasant, at least in a democracy we have the ability to change course, which without using bloodshed, which then incentivizes politicians to act in such a way that isn't all bad, even if they want to be all bad. So at least there's some kind of error correcting machinery. So they're kind of main points that I think that stand out to me, and that's even without going into specific any more details on the McMaster piece. Would you have any thoughts? Any of that rant I just went on?
Yeah, no, there was a lot there. I think if I was to, by the way, I want to correct something I said earlier. I said McMaster worked on the Obama. It was the Trump, and I thought it was as I was saying it.
I was thinking it was Trump. It was 2017 that he was in the Forbidden City.
Yeah, exactly. So as I was talking, I was like, this isn't right. But yeah, no. In regard to the strategic empathy part of the article, I suppose there's a line that sums it up quite nicely. The Chinese Communist Party is not going to liberalize its economy or its form of government. It is not going to play by commonly accepted international rules. Rather, it will attempt to undermine and eventually replace them with rules more sympathetic to China's interests. And it goes on, but effectively, that touched on something I had already been thinking about, because I had already started the exercise of putting myself into the shoes of a government who found itself in control of the largest population in the world, 1.5 billion people, and it's looking at a world which has been dictated to by America. All of the international institutions we have, including the WHO, and we're talking about international justice institutions, all of these different things were set up by Western democracies, and they're now in a position where they're looking at these and they're going, we don't like any of this. If you want us to play with you, then we also get to define some of the rules. We're not playing by the rules you defined when we weren't anything. And I was sympathizing with that. I feel as though he summed it up, because That's so important. That's a really important consideration. Like, you can see why China wouldn't want to accept the WHO, because the WHO was set up by Western society. It's they don't want that. Get out of my face. I'm big enough without you now. Like, and they're not. That's one of the that's one of the things that we can at least rest assured for now, is that they aren't quite big enough without us entirely. But yeah, I think the article that I hadn't heard of strategic empathy, but it had summed up something that I'd come to in an inchoate form on my own, and I found that really interesting.
Yeah, it's really I like the insight, the fact that it has a label, like that's a really, it gives that concept a shape. You know,
Yeah.
the idea of looking out at the world from your bias versus looking out at the world at yourself, putting yourself in someone else's shoes, and the fact that he labeled it like that. I'm not sure. I'd never come across that phrase before, but it's a powerful.
No, I know. Yeah,
You know,
to put it, go on.
I was playing with this earlier on, and it occurred to me as a description for China. Did you watch Game of Thrones?
No.
Oh shit! I don't know if it worked then, but I was thinking of a way of explaining the realities of, and you could just, this is an archetypal kind of a movie example, but a way of explaining the realities of totalitarianism when there's no rule of law, is, you know, like in any movie, there's a character in Game of Thrones called Joffrey, who's this really unpleasant son of a king who becomes a king, and no one likes him, and he's really unpleasant, and he does some awful stuff even before he's ever king himself, and he has this other young fella killed because he kind of embarrasses him, and this nice kid has him killed in a childhood because he embarrasses him in a childhood in an argument between some kids, and but no one can do anything about it because he's the son of a king, you know. And that's a way of thinking about totalitarian governments, is that there isn't a retribution, that there isn't there's no accountability for the people that have positions of power.
Yeah.
Whereas in like Donald Trump can't walk out onto the street and shoot someone, or have so you in Ireland or in the UK, Boris Johnson or Taoiseach here, Leo Varadkar, like they can't, and their family members can't. Like, of course, there's obviously there's potential for corruption and all sorts of stuff, and I'm not saying that the legal system is perfect by any means, and that rich people can potentially get better lawyers. These are all at play, but at least there's a chance to be able to get them. And
it's reciprocal. It's reciprocal in that nature, where there's an accountability, isn't there?
And there's a free press to talk about it. There's an accountability and there's a press to talk about it. So, and
there's a rule of law. So if Donald Trump did shoot somebody, he'd go to prison. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't much matter if you keep all of your support while you're in prison. You'd still be in prison, not being president. So even if it were true that he wouldn't lose a vote, he would lose all of the votes in technical terms, because no one would be able to vote for a Donald Trump that shot somebody in Times Square. Yeah. So it's a really important point to make.
Yeah, and again, there are points that don't even occur to us if we've never thought about what it's like to not be in a liberal democracy. You know, because it just seems like, oh, of course, if a politician can't just go and shoot someone, you know, it just makes. Whereas if you're in China, you can actually get disappeared.
Yeah, no, it's for conveniency. So here, where we have the rule of law, we can't disappear somebody if they stumble across something inconvenient for us, or which could do harm to the government. There's no method by which you could just go, let's just quiet this up and get rid of that person. Whereas in China, there is no such rule of law, and so it's one of its core policies is the repression of its people, the censorship of its people, and the desire to keep the quote unquote peace. It's the
control, stability.
Yeah, I think we can. So it depends how much battery you've got left left on your computer.
Yeah, it looks like it's going to die anytime soon.
We need
There's
to
one
tackle
other,
the 3 prongs
there's one point I wanted to touch
in this
was
part.
that Ender Belt and Road initiative.
All right. Well, we need to do the 3 prongs more fully because I want to touch on many different things, including intellectual property and all of this.
Yeah.
So perhaps we handle the whole thing next time. If there's something you want to briefly say about the Belt and Road, though, feel free.
Yeah, just how it's almost like how would you call it, like an economic imperialism that they're doing. So it's like imperialism without needing to use military intervention, where
It's a shakedown.
Shakedown.
It's a mob like shakedown. You go to Africa, and you go to certain countries in Africa that are desperate. You say, I can help you out, and then they just take it because otherwise they're talking about collapse or just continued starvation and all of this. And you go, yeah, I could help you out, and they take that, and then you come later and go, so we gave you a lot, didn't we? You're sort of indebted to us, really. Then you've got this grip over other countries across the world. Oh man! And the only thing that stopped America or the UK or other Western countries from doing this was an actual sense of an actual conscience. Like, we had the conscience not to put of Africa in our debt. Whenever we gave them money, and we gave them hell of a lot of money over the years, so much money we've given to poverty and all of this for sub-Saharan Africa things and malaria, we do so as a charity, as a donation. We don't do so as a loan or now you as a debt. But China have no such qualms, and so they now have the wealth to do what we could have done for decades, and they're doing it, with this mind towards having that control, as you say. They're power hungry, or at least the best you can read into it is that they just want life to be as easy for them as possible, and so more countries that are indebted to them, the easier it will be for them. You can go quite the other way, though. You can go more extreme and say they have some grand ambitions with having these countries. But I just if that really frustrates me, because it's nothing that we can have done. But of course we didn't do it, because that's awful. It's awful to put countries into debt.
Technically, I think the thing about the West as well is that at one point we did do that. We just took shit.
Yeah, exactly.
And we went through hundreds of years of just taking stuff.
That's exactly it. Yeah, that's why. Because so America we have colonialization. Yeah. We had our colony, so we've been there, done that. We're not touching that again. America had the transatlantic slave trade, and so they've had these sort of interactions with countries in Africa, which are like some of the worst interactions in modern history. Yeah. And so they're sullied by their reputation, and so it's more of a, we need to stay as clean as possible. And China have an awful history, but they couldn't care less.
And there's a point there, is like there was a post by James Lindsay I saw on Twitter last year or some point, maybe even the year before, where he said that something on the lines of, to paraphrase him, that the West didn't invent slavery, racism,
I love this. Yeah.
Chauvinism, any of that stuff. The West didn't invent any of that stuff. The West realized they were bad ideas.
Yeah, exactly. We were the first. So yeah, the Western countries were the first to actually decide this isn't right. Yeah. They've been going on for literally centuries, thousands of years, and first of all, the UK decided, you know what? No, this is wrong. The first country to ever do it, and then America followed soon after. Oh no, this is wrong. This goes against the Constitution, which was founded during the time of slavery. So actually, we were hypocrites from the beginning, and we need to acknowledge that. And that's exactly as you say. But Birbal Singh, a teacher, she said a similar thing in a debate about reparations. Like, we were just the first to realize it was wrong.
Yeah, they were bad ideas. The West was the first place in the world to realise that this stuff was a bad idea. If you even look at like modern day Saudi Arabia, where there's women's rights activists getting tortured in jail for wanting to drive cars.
And Iran.
Yeah, in Iran, yeah, and you look at all. But I think I particularly like Saudi Arabia as an example because it's such a wealthy nation who has ties with the West because of oil and everything, and with OPEC and stuff. So, but then you look at what's going on there, and they're decapitating Shiite Muslims in the street because they're Shiite Muslims. Yeah, because it's a Sunni Wahhabi Salafist situation, and women's rights activists getting tortured in jail, and then obviously we talked about a lot of the Chinese examples with regards to these concentration camps and misuse. But with that Belt and Road thing, that they're putting those really poor countries in, they're lending them money, and then when they're coming to put pressure on to reclaim it, they're like, okay, you're not going to be able to pay us, so how about you give us, according to the article, the McMaster article, and I that they were traded, that these nations traded their debt for equity in the form of ports, dams, airports, power plant, communication networks. So that it's almost so that China come in essentially and just, if you control a country's ports, airports, power plants and communications networks, you control what goes in and out of that country and what can be passed around that country.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like this is stuff that I think this is almost a potential silver lining of this. I suppose we should give a date. It's the 7th of May today. A potential silver lining of this virus on an international geopolitical stage is the realities of China have been brought to the forefront at an accelerated rate that I'm happy with. Like, I'm happy with the fact that these conversations are happening now, because they weren't happening enough. Like, I've only been really interested in Chinese politics since about April-ish last year, May last year. Probably about March, April last year, and I got into this, but it's really interesting.
I wonder what happened then, because I was around the same sort of time. I started first looking into the Belt and Road strategy, and at first I was like, "What's the Belt and Road?" Like I didn't understand what was going on. I was so ignorant about a year and a half ago, and I started looking into it, and I was like, "This thing covers almost 70 countries across the world by land and sea, and it affects, as you said, the shipping, it affects agriculture, the digital economy, tourism, politics. It affects all of these things, and at some point they're going to have so much control they're going to be able to go like freaking Thanos, and then they're going to switch on these links across the globe over which China have complete control. And I was like, wait a minute, that's the scary future, where even if China don't win the other battles, when they have the ability to own points on the map, like at really key areas, and they can transport between them, and they have all of these, that feels like game over in a sense. It's really worrying.
And another advantage. One last point, I suppose, on China is a major advantage that they have with the structure of their government is that because it's not a democracy, a major advantage a dictatorship has over democracy is they're not worried about election cycles. So we have in a liberal democracy 4, 5, 6, 7 year terms, depending on the country, depending on the role, that there's a certain amount of that, the politicking that needs to take place to be able to get re-elected, and it's often short-term thinking that's about the next election cycle, because it's about getting what did you do for me lately, kind of to get votes. Whereas China can think in 10-year blocks, 20-year blocks.
Yeah, and the problem also with our 5-year election cycles is a government comes in and they haven't got a 40-year plan, because they're not even incentivized to do so. So not only are they thinking about what can I get done as fast as possible to look good for the next election cycle, they're also just not even considering what do I have to do to set up for the next good 20 years. It's massive.
But I think even the awareness of the fact that these are the kind of conversations that need to happen, so that, like, even if because you think about it, if the individual voter is aware of the limitation of 4 or 5 year election cycles, that okay, So then politicians are going to be talking about short-term stuff, but I want them to be talking about long-term stuff. Then again, this is the benefit of democracy, is that the will of the voter determines what the politician needs to do and needs to act in order to get the vote. So it's like it comes back to the individual as the most important aspect of a society, each individual, because it's what those individuals want is what the greedy. If you assume, I'm not saying all politicians are greedy monkeys, but if you assume all politicians are greedy monkeys and start from there, then the benefit of a democracy is that you can take advantage of their greed because they're going to be incentivized to follow the will of the people in order to acquire votes. Whereas, that's something that it starts at the individual. That's why I think these kind of conversations are so key, because if people are aware that, oh yeah, geez, I never thought about the fact that we don't put 10 or 20 year plans in place because politicians don't get votes for it because not enough people think about it, you know? So that's kind of like almost a lesson you could learn from a dictatorship that could be brought into a democracy. The same way that Harari in 21 Lessons for the 21st Century talks about asking politicians talking about the big three issues of nuclear war, climate change and technological disruption, because all three of those issues are non-nationalistic problems. They're not got to do with our country or any one country individual, because all three of them affect the whole world. So similar kind of a concept of being aware that there are things that are, first of all, not got to do with directly your country but affect your country, like Harari talked about, but also things that might not be involved in their election cycle but they could put in place for potentially a benefit 15, 20 years on the line, like more focus on, let's say, better prison systems, rehabilitation practices, education, all sorts of other factors that are long-term projects that won't make them look good in 4 years' time when re-election comes up, but may very well be of benefit 20 years on the line. So they're the kind of concepts I think are that in Western liberal democracies in particular, that the average voter needs to be aware of. That there are temporal and spatial realities that do not directly affect them right now, but will. You know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's one of sort of the ironies of an international pandemic like this is that as we find ourselves in a position where these transnational threats call for an international cooperation, they energize the populist nationalist movements that most doom that cooperation.
Yeah.
And so it's just this great irony where we find ourselves now needing the global conversation the most, and people are least prepared to have it.
Yeah.